We have with us, and we're very happy to have Megna Chaudhuri. Meghna is a visiting assistant professor at the Department of History at Boston College. She is currently working on her book project, A Measure of Value, Life, Land, and Agrarian Finance in South Asia, 1830-1960. And on behalf of my fellow conveners and myself, Manuel Bautista, we are very happy and lucky to have Meghna with us today. So just to remind everyone of the mechanics, Meghna will present for about 30 minutes. I will let her know when she has 5 minutes pending, just so that she can start wrapping up. And
Yeah.
once we finish, once she finishes her presentation, we will open the floor for discussion and questions and answers. So thank you very much, Meghna, for having you with us today. And we're very happy to have you. So I'll start the clock now.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. A for reading my paper, B for coming. That's amazing. And, one rarely gets the opportunity to have people actually engage with one's work with some depth. And obviously, thanks so much to, all the wonderful conveners of the Financial History Network. You guys are really, I've already learned so many things from just links and things that you share that, it's just a really great community. So I'm so glad you had the idea to start it. One thing I wanted to say is that I'm not going to reprise the structure and the stuff in my paper in this presentation. I'll go over little bits of it just to connecting threads, but I thought I'd use the presentation to give you a sense of, why I think this history matters at a larger level, and then sort of zoom into the Bombay examples that I've kind of written about. And just upfront, what I'll say is that, I had aimed to think about contract law and forward trades as a lens. That actually is not something I've achieved or even ended up trying to do. And because I realized that I'm so new to the world of contract law and international financial markets in that particular sense. I write about finance through agrarian finance. It's a very different sort of dynamic. And this is an area that I want to learn and develop my knowledge in. And I'm just hoping to hear any sort of, just the questions that arise in your mind from even hearing about something that was actually a really major event, but very few people know about it or write about it. So with that, I'll start with what you're seeing on the screen right now is Bartholomew's economic map of Asia from 1900. Now, the darkest orange, which is covering pretty much all of South Asia, marks regions engaged in international commerce. Now, historians of South Asia have always challenged the assumption that we can understand the region, South Asia, outside the global dynamics of capital, particularly from the 15th century onwards. They have thought about the wider Indian Ocean world and connected histories of commercial exchange as far back as K.N. Chaudhuri's classic work, from the 1960s. And of course, there's so many others that have come subsequently. One really important element of this debate around how South Asia fits into a global history of capital, which is something that South Asian historians have always thought about, is grounded in the mode of production debate, which is itself grounded in agrarian history that played out in the pages of this journal called EPW from the 60s through the early 80s. And it dealt specifically with the potentialities for and trajectories of capitalist development in South Asia. Now, to pull out a signal selection and a much broader discussion that occupied everyone, from economic nationalists to modernization theorists, world systems, and dependency theorists in the 20th century, this debate has mattered to a whole range of scholars. Now, indeed, we can say that South Asia as a field of knowledge, as a knowable object, has been shaped by this question of its place in world historical temporality. In turn, South Asia has left an indelible mark on how post-colonial societies and 20th century theorists problematize capitalist development. So what we can is that South Asian and more broadly Asian histories have long grappled with the history of capitalism, but, and this is important, from an analytical perspective of mapping its absence or divergence from it rather than its presence. More recently, global commodity histories and a new Anglo-American interest in the history of capitalism has directed attention towards the global dynamics of capitalism, marking a shift within those academies, the Western academies, in considering non-Western and colonial sites as part of the story. Looking at this TOC, as you can see, that recently came out in Past and Present, this is a return to an older political economy analysis, and it's no accident, I think, that we've gone back to that kind of analysis as people start grappling with what it means to think about global histories of capitalism. However, and this is I argue, that the running thread through all of these different approaches, old and new, is that they fit colonial spaces into the history of modern capitalism, primarily as sites of extractive accumulation. The material transfer of raw material, bullion, commodities, and labor, which then funds the rise of global capitalist infrastructure by the late 19th century on the back of the British Empire. So it's a sort of drain or a transfer of wealth kind of theory. My work is kind of aimed at resetting the narrative along with a host of other new scholars that 19th century capitalism had a Western locus standi, that the global South fueled the phenomenon as merely the source of capital extracted by Western imperial nations to power their industrialization. We must go beyond seeing South Asia as a case study of interesting variations and alternative cultural histories, and instead see it as rich ground for rethinking the history of capitalism. One element that this paper worked through presenting is a well-known event, the Bombay share market mania, as part of a broader wave of financialized activities that linked every section of Indian society, from the peasant to the miller, to all financiers and capitalists who were part of the formal banking sector that I talk about in my paper, to global money markets. My work is grappling with two major issues in thinking about financialization as neither novel nor recent in South Asia. And this is one, the history of imperially organized capitalism in the 19th century and the relationship between the political, economic, and epistemological coordinates of colonial rule in the post-1857 period. If we think about South Asia and empire and these new histories of business and finance that come out, enthusiastic scholarly responses to Goswami's spatialized category of national economic space as a process and instrument of territorialization have begun to reflect a new interest in histories of business, large-scale investment, particularly the flows of finance, connecting irrigation infrastructures in Egypt, for example, and India to London's financial expansion. These forays have been by and large about the flows of finance, the production of new built environments in port cities, railways, and irrigation infrastructure. But at the very point of Goswami, who sort of wrote about the national economic space, her text was to repudiate the bifurcation of a separate economic space from that of a cultural one. Then this foundational place of capital as process in her analysis has not shaped to any great degree this new scholarship. Space and economy get play, but subjectivity does not. On the other hand, the focus on cultural idioms of experience, new commodity histories, and histories of law and governance, which have populated the historiographical map in the last 3 decades, have served to enrich our understanding of the social worlds of South Asians, particularly articulated through the dynamic between the colonial state and aggregates such as national public, or the remaking of existing community groups like gender, class, and categories such as gender and class. But they have found it adequate to categorize the financial relationship between Britain and India as broadly extractive. So India is just a source for the extraction and accumulation of capital for the West, and a backdrop against which to make South Asian socio-cultural experience come alive. Certainly, any discussion of the relationship between the government of India and its Indian subjects in the historiography of the last 30 years has not explored aspects of the specifically financial dimension of that relationship, both in the way the imperial and colonial economies increasingly operated in relation to each other, as well as the way in which the colonial state related to its Indian subjects through its specifically financial dynamics. In 1840, 80% of the total revenue of British India came from agriculture, 65% came from agriculture, so 80% came from agriculture and salt and opium monopolies. So in total, 65 plus 15 makes 80. In 1860, the total was 75%. In 1913, land revenue plus salt and opium covered less than 50% because of the increase of other taxes. But by then, and this is important, farmers and agricultural workers undergirded the empire in other crucial ways. Amongst other things, they were producers of industrial and food crops like cotton, consumers of British textiles and manufacturers, and the lives that made British military victories in the global arena possible. They were also the crucial financial base of the financial domination of India by Britain. How did the Indian peasant life become wrapped in a developing regime increasingly controlled by finance capital? I specified that the financial domination of India as subservient to the needs and extension of Britain's international financial arrangements was achieved through the reformulation of the relationship between the colonial state and society through specifically financial dynamics. In the paper you read, one major theme tracking through it was the emergence of a productive subject as the subject of this financial dynamic. As the paper shows, the productive subject was conceived of as the peasant producer versus unproductive indigenous financier or moneylender. And this kind of opposition emerges, I argue, through the way in which the Bombay speculation boom was read and analyzed and used to then racialize elements of Indian society as a whole. Through the early 1860s, investments in Bombay's land market and cotton trade grew, but like a long fuse, the brighter it burnt, the faster it traveled towards the tinderbox of instabilities of an unregulated banking apparatus in Bombay. The Back Bay Company, what you're seeing in red encapsulated is the Back Bay area of Bombay's coastline. The Back Bay Company, named after the reclamation of that land, was at the heart of the speculation in land futures from reclaimed coastlines that ultimately felled the Bank of Bombay. As you read in the paper, it was the Bank of Bombay launched 400 shares into the market that it owned in the Back Bay Company because there were questions raised around this rather dubious public-private speculation in land futures. And in fact, the dumping of this huge number of shares, 400 shares into the Bombay market, is what launched the spiraling speculative mania of land reclamation companies, including sort of the launching of 60 other financial companies in the following 2 years until the end of the American Civil War in 1865. Now, this scene is from the share market outside the New Oriental Bank in October 1865 at the height of Bombay's share market mania. Bombay's land development and share market speculation, catalyzed by the sudden global demand for cotton in the early 1860s, was equally fueled by European and British bankers, including prominent government officials who sat on the board of the Bank of Bombay, which in fact acted as the bank of banks to all these other speculating financial institutions. The committee that was appointed in London to report to Parliament on the Bombay speculation and the failure of the Bank of Bombay and its role in it spent a good amount of time on the personal failings of various managing officials of the Bank of Bombay, but elevated one individual's extraordinary abilities as the ultimate reason for the bank's descent into profitable illegality, and it fixated on and named Premchand Roychand as the reason for the speculative mania, and he sort of became the prism through which projections were made about what the reasons for the Bombay boom were. Now, Roychand came from a Surati family of erstwhile Jains of the Banya community, a specific caste associated with money lending, well known for its banking and brokering services. Premchand, though officially on the board of directors of the Bank of Bombay only briefly during these years, was closely involved in managing and advising the personal investments of several of the other directors, including European directors who also served on the government of Bombay. Why was Premchand and Indian financiers more generally blamed? The answer lies in the understanding the social relations of capital, I argue in the paper, as they played out in Bombay. Now, unlike Calcutta, which had been transformed from a productive space of investment and industrial growth to the classic imperial relationship of being a source of raw material and a dumping ground for manufacturers, Bombay was on the upswing from the 1850s for a number of reasons that I detail in the paper, primary amongst them railways investments and land reclamation schemes for Bombay's coastline. Bombay was still, at the time of the American Civil War, a space of competition between Hindu, Parsi, and European financiers. The credit boom, jointly fueled by financiers of all races and communities, however, made the fact of race uncomfortably clear and evident in the moment of the crash. At a scalar level of global and territorial economies, British trade and international credit was beginning to rely on more and more on the credit of India and the more direct subservience of the Indian sphere of the economy to the imperial global British economic sphere. I would argue that the argument that the universalization of drive of capital expressed in the context of competition between Indian capitalists and the colonial state is an essentially racist logic of colonial governance for subordinating indigenous capital. However, what I'm saying is that it's an illuminating articulation of the fetish form. To take the expansionary drive of capital as above all a social process is to unpack the fetish form at the heart of these processes, to use the concept of Marxian political economy. The unfolding of this social process obscures its own social conditions and thus its own social nature. So the blame for the Bombay speculation bubble falling on Indian capitalists and financiers involved in it becomes possible specifically because of the social relations that undergird Bombay's financial and economic role in global markets at this time, where it's very much an economy that runs through the India-China trade routes, and the London money markets are being navigated not just by European financiers, bankers, and managing agency directors, but equally by Parsi financiers as well as Banya brokers who sort of rise to very sort of intermediate but key relations, as we saw with Premchand's role in the board of directors of the Bank of Bombay. And it was by no means some sort of anomaly or a one-off. There were hundreds of such figures. The inextricably enmeshed nature of the supposedly formal banking world, itself emerging as a space of competition between these Hindu, Parsi, and European financiers, and the informal layer through whose bills of exchange most credit operations were conducted, was uncomfortably revealed in the parliamentary inquiries into the Bombay speculation. In this reasoning, the consequences of the volatility of the global cotton market in the everyday economic activity of hedging risks had damagingly spiraled out of control, precisely because the market in which it occurred was organized around a set of social relations where the indigenous financial operator played a prominent role. Such a market could only be inherently unstable, ran the logic. To stabilize it, the colonial state theorized it would require a separation of that which now emerged as its fundamentally illegitimate part. So the rational pursuit of profit was theorized as universal, but the ability to develop an internal regulating morality was in this reading culturally particular. The shocking flouting of regulations that created the speculative bubble was explained away through racialized logics, highlighting the venal qualities in particular of Hindu Banyas, who were also blamed squarely for the Deccan agrarian uprisings in 1874, when their cotton spun fortunes waned with the end of the American Civil War, and the Banya creditors of the peasants who produced that cotton and had suffered the shocks of the decline in prices came calling. But what did this have to do with peasant proprietors, and why have I brought that element into the paper? So the so-called speculative tendencies that I quoted Richard Temple as saying in the paper of colonized Indians was a point of heightened awareness and state repression in the late 19th century. And we see it in a number of sources, sort of like the colonial common sense. Richard Temple, the finance minister for India in the late 1860s, and then subsequently holds various important positions that I talk about in the paper, he focused on peasant proprietors in order to cultivate their interests through regulated investments in life insurance, and was formulated against the figure of the Banya moneylender who operated, it's sort of implied, through debased, violent passion. To go back to the quote that I have in the paper, the amount of unused capital existing in India is almost melancholy to contemplate. Temple was speaking to a group of bankers in the summer of 1881 at the Institute of Bankers in London. This is an oft-repeated lament, not only by state officials, but across the board, from nationalist economists to John Maynard Keynes to our present moment, that India has this sort of like large amount of indigenous capital that's being hoarded and not in productive circulation. Temple outlined what he believed. Almost every Indian subject was in fact a banker in situ. Not only were Britain's Indian subjects numerous in number, the vast majority of them were already part of a complex informal network of banking whose reach extended to every important financial center in the world, he implied. Here, the actual runners of the network, the indigenous bankers and money lenders, Banyas, were not the object of his attention. Rather, it was the 7 million peasant proprietors and 26 million cultivators. So the Bombay share market bubble of 1860-65 shaped this distinction between agrarian producers as potentially productive speculators if guided by the state into becoming responsible investors, and as opposed to the Indian merchant money lender focused in through the figure of Premchand classes as reckless speculators from whom the state hoped to wrest control over transcontinental flows of massive amounts of indigenous capital. I'm done with this for now. So I'm done with my presentation. I think I raced through a little bit. I could have gone a little slower, but I can sort of end this show here. Manuel, what do you think I should do?
Give me just 1 second. So we have 10 minutes. I don't know if you want, we can start the question and answers session.
Yeah.
So I invite people to let us know in the chat if they have a question. I may ask one just to begin. As I was looking at your presentation, and I was reading these quotes from the sources that you have explored. I thought if you had considered the possibility of looking at the financial developments occurring elsewhere in the British Empire, and here I thought of Egypt as a sort of economy that also experiences an increase in the cotton production, particularly after the American Civil War. I cannot refer you to any author, of course, at this moment I'm blanking, but that's what I thought I wanted to mention to you. And thank you for the beautiful visuals you presented.
Shall I take that question? Thanks so much, Manuel.
Sure, you can take it.
Yeah. No, I mean, absolutely, you're bang on. In fact, this is what I'm teaching this week to my students. They're learning about the 1906-7 crisis in Egypt, which is a credit boom that's fueled by cotton and then collapses because precisely of the same scenario of very cheap credit being available. And slightly different and relates to another chapter in my work, but I won't go into that. But yeah, I mean, what we're really seeing is the phenomenon you're identifying, which is of these of Bombay representing not just the port city and its own sort of financial institutions, but Bombay representing a node into the sort of hinterlands of India. And the sort of promise of value that can generate through the labor of the peasant cultivator, in this case through the production of cotton and all the various abstractions through which that cotton then goes, including in producing the credit for this fictitious land that is generated from these financial companies that come up precisely because Bombay City is flooded with a huge amount of money with the increase in the cotton boom. With that money needs to go somewhere. And it's part of a larger phenomenon from the 1870s onwards, where places like Egypt and India become the focus or sort of these fields of sites on which financial investment seeks to go. So although by 1914, the amount of investments, foreign investments that are coming into India are certainly not very high in terms of what we see in the 1860s when railways were being invested in. It's rather in this financial and abstract manner that India and Egypt become these sites for the generation of finance capital at the metropole.
Very good. Thank you, Meghna. So I'm going to give the Shweta Banerjee the next place in the queue. She has a question. So go ahead, Shweta.
Thanks, Manuel, and thanks, Meghna. This is really, really great. This is a super presentation. curious, and this is, as much a question to you as it is for the network also as a whole, because I've also been thinking about financial history and financialization. And there's sort of these varied chronological ways of looking at financialization. So some people say it was the sort of abolishing of the gold standard. Some people say it was the rise of neoliberalism in the 70s. And so how are we defining financialization? How far back can we use that term? And how can we get more specific about it? I mean, it's sort of a general question to everybody, including myself, actually.
No, this is super important, and obviously one of the framing chronological issues and conceptual issues for me. So as you might have gathered, maybe from a little bit from the people, and maybe some of the stuff I say pretty openly on my any kind of bio I have or whatever, is that when I'm talking about the emergence of the productive subject as a category through which the colonial state instances a specifically financial domination of India rather than an extractive accumulationary raw material extractive sort of relationship, I'm talking about credit as a means for creating a new type of person for which the peasant producer is seen as the ideal recipient of this kind of educational credit, which is very resonant with and something that I talk about in several other chapters in my book of present day microcredit and developmentalism. That's one. The second thing I want to say is that I am personally of the opinion that while neoliberal financialization is a very specific historical moment, to do with the collapse of Bretton Woods and that 1970s moment of the expansion of financial capital, precisely because the existing, industrial economies of England and America sort of reached that kind of economies of scale. They're not going to produce they're not going to produce any more profit if they remain just located within that spatial geography, and they need to go outwards. I would say that neoliberalism is to me, or the way that I think about it, is not a post-capitalist or a post-moment. I think that it illuminates and elaborates a specific dynamic of capital as a social process that I am tracking back to a prior chronology, to modern capitalism, and specifically in this moment of modern capitalism articulating itself through the subservience and creation of peripheral economies to core economies, specifically through the financial dynamic. So that's how I think about the relationship to the neoliberal, rather than saying the neoliberal is a new thing, but rather an elaboration of something that's very core to the process of capital, if that makes sense. And yeah, but I'd love to talk more about this. I'm still, I'm still thinking about it, obviously.
Thank you, Shrita. Thank you, Meghna. So next question in the queue is by Erika Rappaport. Erika, if you want to make your question now.
Yeah, okay, thank you so much. This was a great paper. There's so much to think about. And I particularly love the way, I don't know, you're playing with different levels of scale of analysis between a kind of local, sorry, I have my cat being annoying, local analysis and critiquing this broad global, the histories of global capitalism, which I said I've been a little bit guilty of in my book on tea, but I also was trying to break up that model, not just from India as a drain, but the whole global South as a drain feeding into either labor also, if we think about slavery. But your paper made me think about an article I wrote a really long time ago that I got fascinated, which I called the Bombay Debt, of a British family. The man was in the East India Company before, throughout the 1850s and 1860s. And I got interested in the social relations of the family. They owed this money, which they never named, to a Parsi moneylender, and tried to get money from the mother-in-law in England in order to pay off this Bombay debt, which was emasculating and emasculating the husband and then causing problems with the wife, marital difficulty. So I was interested in the whole kind of social relations of credit and debt. And I was thinking that might be a great place. it was the opposite of the drain model. It just clicked, like my light bulb went off, you know, in the sense of these British that are indebted to Indians in India during that period. So that would be a great way. I don't know if you're gonna do more work, but I found it really illuminating to look at away from the global capital. It was just the opposite, basically. This is a failed family in a whole host of ways. But looking at failure might be a way of getting around that model too. I don't know. I just found it inspiring, and I wondered if you had been interested in thinking about those kinds of social relations of credit and debt, maybe between businesses as well. You know, I was sort of thinking in family terms in that paper, but just thinking about, you know, the kind of function between shareholders and, you know, all the different social relations you could look at.
Yeah, and no, thank you so much for that. I'm going to look up your paper right after this. I mean, one of the, I rushed through this, so I should have, you know, but for example, one of the people that I put up on, you know, on the presentation, Jahangir Kaurji Reddy Money, Parsi. I mean, he's someone, for example, is also on the board of Bank of Directors, totally has, you know, his signatures on a number of dubious loans they give out right in the middle of the speculation on personal, you know, just on the personal authority of his signature and so on and so forth. But he's also, the Parsis are seen as essentially a sort of, there's a way in which Parsi capital is not seen as threatening as is seen the figure of the indigenous capitalist, in the which is, you know, tuned through the Banya figure, specifically because of these credit instruments like the hundi, which was really critical to the functioning of the formal banking economy, like the Bank of Bombay, the Bank of Bengal. These all took hundis. It just wasn't officially on the books because you couldn't possibly operate in finance in India if you weren't going to take credit instruments that through the bulk of the credit of this of the regional economies moved into the central nodal port cities. So the Parsis were seen as divorced from that particular channel of, you know, illicit credit, and they were also more European and Western in their alignment to the British. So it's an alignment of, you know, we could be allies. So for example, Kaurji Reddy Money, you know, donated a ton of money for some fountain to come up in Hyde Park, or, you know, one of those, and you know, was knighted and so on and so forth. I mean, there were these social relations of credit that elaborate also. I mean, they're not just, it's not, but what the argument I'm making is it's not just some blind, you know, hierarchization of racist thought, but there's the conditions of possibility for making those assessments come from the alignment of the ways in which these particular holders of capital were relating to each other in the regional economy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. So now we're going to follow Thomas Timberg's. Thomas Timberg's question, it comes next. I just want to point that Shweta wrote. I'm sorry. Yes, just continue. Let's go with Thomas. Is Thomas going to read his question?
I can look at the chat. I can't
I'll
see a question from Thomas.
I'll read it because it's in a direct message. Okay. So the question is, or the London and New York commercial press paid heavy attention to the Mumbai financial and interrelated commodity markets. The question is, what trends in that coverage did you note? By the 1920s, the markets were formally linked, overlapping exchange membership. Have you followed that process at all?
Overlapping what membership, sorry?
Overlapping exchange membership of both the financial and commodity markets by the 1920s.
What I would say is that I haven't extensively looked at the press coverage of this event, other than some of the stuff, some of which I even have had up in my presentation and my paper. But in general, this is something that you see with financial crashes of the time, and I actually analyzed this crash alongside this insurance crash in 1869 that happens, the Albert Life Insurance Company, that also leads to a number of crashes in insurance companies that have their headquarters in India. So, and what I would note from just having studied this decade of financial crashes that connect India and England is that the financial crash speaks to financial crashes and speculative booms is very much the natural proclivity of all people. However, when it comes down to making a throwaway comment as to why this has happened, it's always pegged to the what's the word for it? The lack of experience, the inexperience of Indian bankers. So so even with the example that I had from the London Illustrated News, it's very much that, there's a dichotomy created between the so-called regulated, quiet, professional, money market transactions in London versus these sort of crazy, mad, passionate crowds in India. However, that's the sort of the end point. During throughout, as the events are sort of unraveling, that's analyzed very much as an everyday kind of, this is part of what I talk about, how it is that financial crisis continues to not have an explanation. Economists and lay commentators continue to talk about the coming of financial crisis as like some sort of weather phenomenon. The market's looking, bad. Before the pandemic hit, honestly, I was terrified because I kept reading things in The Economist and, I was following various, financial newspapers and so forth. There's always some sort of like, it's the 10-year anniversary, 2008 in 2018, and immediately there was this weather talk of like, it feels like a crisis is going to come, this gathering clouds, whatever. So this is the language through which the speculation mania was discussed as these sort of almost external events that seem to be moved by an external impersonal force. And it's only in the final analysis when you come down to a parliamentary report that has to be produced that this kind of very specific racialization happens. And just to give you an example, a sort of concomitant crash that happens, the Albert crashes, and so does the New Economic Insurance Company in 1869 and 1870 in England and then in India. In both those cases, the dichotomy between the morality and the rationality is not held. So it's more like, obviously the ordinary person is going to try and get the best bargain, and it's obvious also that there's going to be this lapse in morality. But in specifically the case of a mixed economy that articulates these different social relations of capital in Bombay, then you sort of see the racialization of that, that moral impetus to regulate oneself. In terms of the coming together of the commodity and money markets by the 1920s, what I'd say is that the racial composition had changed. So what happened with this financial domination of the Raj is that you sort of have first of all, the India-China trade kind of becomes kind of unsteady by 1900, 1920s, and it's no longer as big as it was when opium was still being shipped. So that also changes the regional dynamics of what the players are out of Bombay, so the coming together of the commodity and money markets is not necessarily an indication of a change in the social relations of capital. Rather, we've already seen by this point, we've already seen the sort of various measures taken to prevent Indian investors from raising money and raising capital in India to then take on various sort of industrial or financial projects.
Well, I've now finally got myself back on, so perhaps you can hear me. A full disclosure, I spent a good deal of my Indian historical life looking at these how do I say, indigenous markets, which the British were and I've just recently finished a study of the 1944 Bombay silver corner, where for various reasons, there's a lot of inside documentation from all parties, basically because it was broken by the United States selling 100 million ounces of silver, eventually 200 million plus to the Indian government. Now, when I was talking about the overlap, all I was saying was by the 20s and 30s, yes, there was a lot of British reaction, but a number of the Indian businessmen had also figured out how to get into the market. So there were several Indian members of the New York Cotton Exchange. And in fact, the Wall Street Journal published in 1946 a note, an article about Govindram Saksaria, who was one of the key cotton speculators, is passing away. There were also members of the Silver Exchange in Montreal and so forth. And those are all, the thing that intrigues me is the attitudes you're talking about. In the 1870s and 80s and 90s and in the teens, we have articles all over the Wall Street Journal and Financial Times. So all I'm saying is that matters may have changed a bit by the 20s and 30s, but not that there isn't the same resistance, but that the Indian side may have figured a little bit about what it could do. I mean, another.
There was always this kind of, No, go ahead, please. I mean, everything you're saying.
I would say the other example I was thinking of is you said very earlier that that the British banks, essentially, the Imperial Bank, and then earlier the Bombay, the regional banks, these all did advance money to the traditional markets. They had to. They all, or most of them, made loans, for example, against gold. So once you get loans against gold and silver, you can speculate with gold and silver. But you mentioned that they didn't put it on their books. As a matter of fact, by the 20s and 30s, so-called Shakarpuri hundis were a standard investment thing. In fact, it fits very much with your account in the sense that it had to do with the seasonality of Indian agriculture and the response.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. That was like a generalization. I mean, some hundis were put on the book, but what I will say about this later period, the 1920s and 30s, which is something that I also write about, when I talk about the rise of Indian capital raised joint stock banks, is that this is an old argument by Omnio Bagchi, which is that yes, they had to deal in hundis and various Indian credit instruments, but it was very much on their own terms. So when there was a credit crunch in any sort of Indian-run institution, whether it's a banking one or another sort, the Bank of Bengal, which acts as the Bank of Banks, wouldn't actually give credit even on the security of government bills of security. So it wouldn't take its own collateral as bonds for. So this is and that someone like Keynes or whatever and were realized that the best way to make the economy nationally work was if there was a central bank, but there's a reason why the central bank and the centralization of banking was resisted, specifically because this kind of ad hoc organization allowed for both the Europeans and the British to make more money of these kind of like interstitial transactions, and to not allow the formal recognition of the ones that were already formally on the book. So that sort of arrangement was in place in the 20s and 30s. But thank you so much for your comments. They were very illuminating.
Thank you, Thomas, for making your question, and for Meghna for responding. I'm gonna read Ritam's question.
Manuel, are we taking?
Sorry?
No, I was just saying, I think my audio sort of popped out.
Oh, okay. So the question Ritam has, which I am going to read is, hi, Meghna, thanks for a fascinating paper. I wonder if you could perhaps say a little more on the fetishized conception of the indigenous financier. What does the posing of fetish do in your paper vis-a-vis Ritu Birla's vernacular capitalism as annotated by Shweta? Is the credit-rich peasant producer also a fetishized entity?
Yes, in the paper, I specifically make this argument in relation to Birla's argument around vernacular capitalists. And so her argument is extremely influential and still holds and is very, generator. And her argument is basically that from the 1880s, you see this dichotomization of the economy as a separate sphere of discourse as well as financial activity that's made as a realm that's only for Europeans, and whereas the any kind of economic or financial activity undertaken by indigenous or vernacular capitalists, specifically she focuses on the Marwari, who are Banyas, so the Marwari moneylender merchant banker. Any activity they undertake is constantly being regulated through the law to constantly make it illicit and illegitimate. So it's a sphere of culture. So any kind of, so the satta or the time bargain that I talk about in this paper, that's very much part of the Bombay speculation mania in which everyone's participating. It's just one form of what is essentially the satta, sauda, and several other the indigenous moneylenders, the forward tradable part of agrarian commerce. Since you can go back to 17th century Japan. So this forward trade in agricultural commodities is not new, and but their activities in forward trading was sort of bifurcated as cultural activities, culturally specific ones. Now, the specific argument I'm making is that if one takes this, if we think about this phenomenon, what I'm saying is that the law, which is the modality through which Birla articulates her argument, is this
we're having a little bit of
expansionary drive. That this 1870s to 1900, this moment of, sorry, is this better or am I?
It's better now. It's better now. Sorry.
Okay, so yeah, so sorry about that. So what I was saying is that if we just take, if this is not a creation of the law, nor is it a creation, it's not, nor is it chronologically starting from the 1880s, and it's not just a discursive phenomenon, and it's not also just one that, so the law for me is this one modality through which this fetish is being articulated. What is a fetish? It is the taking as the form of appearance, what our experience appears to us as the face of it. So we take it at face value. So we take the table that exists in front of us as just the table that comes to us from, because I bought it off Amazon, as opposed to seeing the various social relations behind the production of that table. In this case, the fetish is to not acknowledge the fetish is to sort of make an analysis of colonial governance purely as racist, where racism is essentialized to the British. So why did they think that the Indians couldn't be financial, and why were the vernacular capitalists sidelined? Because they were racist. Racism is endemic to white colonists, so they were racist. Why did they do this? Because they were racist. It's tautological. What are the social relations through which cultural expressions of ideology, of which racism is an ideology, are expressed? That's what I'm trying to illuminate when I make the specific distinction for this period. Mona, I'm going to think about, I don't want to, let me think a little bit more about the last part of your question, and maybe we can talk about it.
Thank you, Meghna. Next in the Q&A queue are Geeta Patel and then DS. So Geeta, if you want to make your question.
Hi, Meghna. It's great to see you.
Geeta. It's great to see you. I want to tell everybody that Geeta is the first person I ever told about my project, because I was in the British Library, terrified that I didn't have a PhD topic. It was my second year and I didn't like what I worked on already. And I was super bored, and I was randomly looking at all sorts of other records, and I just fell upon, this life insurance scam that I fell upon in the 1880s. And she was there, and I remember having this long 2-hour chat with her. So it's lovely to see you, Geeta.
Oh, it's fabulous. And it's great to see what you've done with it. It's like, I'm really excited. I'm so happy. The talk was wonderful. I didn't get the paper, by the way, so I don't know.
I can email it to you after.
Okay.
I don't know how, I don't know whether it went out with the Eventbrite or whatever, but I can email.
No.
I can email whoever would like the paper after this. I'm happy.
I'd love it. Yeah, I'd love it. So, and I'd love to, I'll read the paper and we can chat. But I actually love what you're doing, because one of the things So I don't know if I told you at the time, but I'm working on the Madras Civil Fund. My archives are sitting in Noida right now because I had to leave in a hurry. But actually, to think about the fact that sort of the way in which financialization has been in place and produces certain notions of folk. So it's like a doubling of the way in which social relations work, right? Which I think you're doing in a very articulate and necessary fashion, which is the finance form. If you de-fetishize it, you see the social relations that are embedded in it and make it possible. And then the finance form produces new forms of sociality and social relationships, right? So it's a double de-fetishization, and it allows us to rethink the place of the financial. So, I mean, this goes back to Shweta's question, which is, partly I go back and forth with doing work on the contemporary and doing work. I mean, I teach the deep history, starting with, banking relations in the Mauryan period as well. Partly to understand, so partly, the whole form of neoliberalism, which I think you're saying very clearly, sort of allows us to have a fantasy of the present, right? And it's a very fetishized fantasy of the present to hold on to a capitalist idea of what we think we are right now. So the thing I wanted to ask, I mean, there's so much, obviously, I have to read your whole work because I was trying to find it. So I wanted to ask about insurance, because I know you were working on it in a particular way, but I mean, I'd love to hear more on the chapter, but also, Lakshmi Subramanian's work on hundis from Agra, right? That, and it's insurance is written into the movement of the hundi, right? Yeah. And so I was thinking, well, there's one question with that, and then another question which has to do with weather and racialization. So insurance, so partly hundis, as you know, partly hundis are financialized because they work in relation to discount markets, right? So for example, cotton producers in the US bought hundis on discount from London, so they had effectively pounds to pay for imports, right? So hundis become a form of circulating capital. But on the discount market, what you made me think about is we think of muddati and sahayog, the different forms of hundi, right? Yeah. But on the discount market, what you're making me understand is perhaps the racialization of who has them, who they're written from, how they're written, actually changes their value, right? So in some ways, racialization then becomes a percentage of the insurance written into discounting. So I'm curious about that, right? Because you made me, I mean, I hadn't thought about it, but until you raised the question, because I've been tracking forms of discounting. But the other thing I was thinking about, which is the metaphor, which is, it's interesting that you brought up the weather metaphor, because I was thinking about 1860s racialization, for example, and that's starting from, I'd say, like the 1830s onwards into the 1880s, you have people like Lambrosco. There are all these genres of racialization, and one of them is around weather. Actually, it starts in the 1700s, right? So certain types of folk that are racialized because of their alignment with the weather. So I was wondering, like, so when you think about about seasonality and using weather as a metaphor, is it a kind of activated metaphor in the sense? I don't know if you know Yael Navarro's work on metaphors on Cyprus. It's really interesting to think with, but so metaphors activate forms of racialization that then might or might not work into the ways in which racialization is written into the discounting of a hundi. So I don't know. It made me think. So any of those, and then obviously I'd love to have you do a whole talk on your insurance chapter, but that's a different question entirely.
No, you know what? Let me write you right after this. I think I've lost a lot to learn from you. A, I don't even know as much about these onlys in international circulation as you do, and I'm hoping to hear from anyone else who can help me out on this. Particularly the law aspect of it is a separate issue. So yeah, I mean, thank you for raising those questions. I've taken them down. I'll email you with them. I would also like to think through that the racialization and the ascription of value in that sort of anthropological way rather than the sort of Marxian political economy way that I'm. So I do want to think about value in this dual way, and I do it in other parts of my work. But right now, yeah. So yeah, but I'll just write you, and I'm hoping we can chat.
Okay, it's
Thanks
great.
So
We'll set something up and have a long, exchange. Great.
Thank you, Geeta. So I do have one final question from DS. And this was wonderful. Thank you. I'm wondering if you could say more about this opposition between the peasant and the Banya. To what extent should we understand the moneylender peasant opposition as something mobilized by colonialism rather than something invented?
Rather than something invented, sorry, I don't think I got the question.
So
something invented.
yes.
Oh, I got it. Right, got it. Yes. Okay. So what I will say is this. So right from the start of British interaction in South Asia, so as early as the 1820s, 1810s, which is when you're seeing this kind of ethnographic work that's coming out, where you are, where you essentially, particularly in Bengal, which is the first sort of, spatial region where the British really entrenched themselves, you're seeing these long articles about the moneylender as the linchpin of Indian society, where Indian society is being seen as this kind of sociological category that's rooted in the village, and in which the moneylender plays a caste-specific, occupation-specific role. So the British have always seen the moneylender as this kind of avaricious, Shylock figure, which is the way that they theorize the moneylender also, again, as vis-a-vis the Egyptian seller, the Egyptian cultivator, also seen as being at the mercy of these sort of, Shylock-like figure. Very similar to the ways in which moneylenders are talked about in India. However, it's not like, even though that is being said, it's not the same thing in the 1820s as it is from the 1860s. Now, specifically, my argument is that after 1857, after the transfer of power to the crown, so it's no longer the company business. It's not the East India Company state. It's the British imperial state. We're seeing several meta shifts. One is that we're seeing lots of wars that the British are financing. For example, in Afghanistan, through India's finances. We're also seeing a huge expansion of money that's going off into the military because they are so scared after this 1857 shock. There's a huge modernization drive of infrastructure and for the military, so barracks and so on and so forth. And you see a stoppage of the investment in public works like dams and irrigation, which we are seeing in the 1840s and 50s, railways, dams, and so on and so forth. That money is being funneled off into development, but development is specifically aimed at the mobilization of imperial military force and imperial finance. So, for example, a famine insurance fund is started because of these famines that start coming up in the 1870s really regularly. But that fund then becomes the sort of the capital through which other loans are taken to fund other wars on the peripheries of India, northeast and northwest. So, what we're basically seeing is a cash crunch that the government of India under Britain is experiencing. Now, part of their desire to sort of plug into the peasant proprietor, not just the landless laborer, but the peasant proprietor. Specifically, you can see in the shifts in colonial legislation. So until the early 19th century, there's a focus on landholders, big landholders. So the permanent settlement in Bengal, for example. Now from the 1850s onwards, we see something called the Rent Reform Act, which is where the colonial state actually starts using the argument of custom rather than law to recognize proprietary right through the laboring capacity of the peasant. So a peasant says, I worked on this piece of land in Bengal for 12 years. Then it's deemed as being an occupancy peasant proprietor. So even though they don't have the title in land, they have property in their cultivating labor. In this dynamic, how does the moneylender fit? The moneylender fits in as this moneylender siphoning off all the money that the peasant proprietor generates through his produce by taking, this is Shahid Amin's argument for later 19th century, for example, that the moneylender worked as this middleman who basically takes off the money of the peasant's hand because they're constantly in that cycle of debt. You can only cultivate because you're able to take debt. Then you pay off your debt by paying what you made in the crop, and then you're again back in the cycle of debt. Now now the thing is that the colonial state is constantly trying to tap into that moneylender's role. Now, ultimately, because the colonial state wants to have a direct relationship. So, for example, this is Aaron Jakes' work that I'm going to mention, that Manuel brought up Egypt earlier, and I talk about it in one of my other chapters. The idea of microloans was first floated in India in the 1870s. After the Deccan riots, when Deccan peasants burnt ledgers and they burnt moneylenders' homes, the colonial government was like, you know what? The great financial solution to this is London's money markets need investment channels for their capital. You know what we should do? We should have London investors like the Rothschilds give out direct small loans to Indian peasant cultivators so they can bypass the moneylender. So the slew of legislation that I track kind of shows the emergence of the moneylender as a specific kind of antagonist to the peasant proprietor, the unregulated, reckless speculator who's taken part in the Bombay speculation mania, and the peasant proprietor is a sort of noble soul who's laboring on the land, who can instead be inducted into a colonial circuit of investment rather than an indigenous vernacular circuit of investment. I've just given you broad sketches. And ultimately, I mean, just to close that loop, someone like Shahid Amin's important work on sugarcane in the UP, the argument he ends up kind of showing and elaborating is that why is it that the colonial state ultimately didn't centralize and clear, same argument I made about central banks. Why didn't they centralize factory production for sugarcane and its route to the market? Because at that point, by the time Amin's research is ongoing, it's more profitable for the colonial state to farm the revenue that the moneylender farming of the peasant proprietors than to try and have that direct link, because they've seen with the Egypt crash of 1907 that if you link the peasant producer too directly to international money markets, as they saw with the Deccan riots as well, you open yourself up to political instability, because the peasant is just going to take the price in cotton or sugarcane falling in international money markets, sees default on the loan to London, and then rise up against the government. So having that intermediate oppositional category worked for these various and contradictory reasons. Sorry, that was a lot.
No, that's great. We have no more time for your session. The webinar session has ended for now. So I want to thank you, Meghna, for your presentation and for a lively discussion to all of the attendees. And we remind you all that our next webinar session will take place on April 12th, also at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. The Politics of Arbitrage, Connecting and Disconnecting Global Markets, 1870-1920, by John Handel, PhD candidate in history at the University of California in Berkeley. And we really, really want to thank you, Meghna, for your presentation and everyone for attending. So thank you so much.
Fabulous.